Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And today we are talking about Ian Szabo's The Adolescence of a Concept, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, and the Kautsky's Revolutionary Writings from January 29th, 2025 at Cosmonaut Magazine. And this is kind of a corollary. Ian's actually been on one of my shows. I think it was either Theorizing with a Hammer or Symptomatic Redness before he became part of the Cosmonaut orbit. I've followed his writings for a while, and I wanted to talk about this here. And I wanted to cover it because I was a little frustrated with Hal Draper's coverage of this. I recently did a series covering all of the dictatorship of the proletariat from Marx to Lenin and Hal Draper, and went even into parts of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, volume 3 and 4, to even get further clarification on the concept. And I did find the Kautsky discussion to be a little undercooked. So I wanted to come here and use Ian's work to talk about that. Kautsky's writings on the dictatorship of the proletariat serve as a waypoint between Marx and Lenin. Ian Szabo argues an analysis of Kautsky's democratic, republican, revolutionary, Marxist political ideas. All right. I like the new Cosmonaut layout, by the way. It's way easier to print off for this sort of stuff, and also pretty easy to read, but I do have to make it a lot larger when covering it here. All right. Let's get into this. At the turn of the 20th century, Karl Johann Kautsky, 1854 to 1938, nicknamed the Pope of Marxism, was widely considered the most important theorist of the international socialist movement. Yeah, I agree. His work, The Road to Power, was more read by anything than Marx in his lifetime. His chief text on Marxist politics, the Offered Program and the Social Revolution, defined what it meant to be a Marxist for many in the movement. I also love The Road to Power, too. Kautsky is today a relatively forgotten figure. I don't know. I mean, not in our circles, but yeah. And not in neo-Kautskyist circles, which neo-Kautskyist, I think, is really young Leninist most of the time. Although I guess there is the Eric Blanc school neo-Kautskyism, which is a little different. Defined by what it meant to be a Marxist for many in the movement. Kautsky today is a relatively forgotten figure whose voluminous writings go more or less unread, even by scholars of Marxist theory and historians of socialism. I need to do this with the Road to Power one day, just the entire fucking book. Anyway, so forgotten is Kautsky that some later students and academics believed his first name was Renegade, based on Vladimir Lenin's hostile pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Kautsky, a Czech-Austrian historian and journalist, was viewed by many during his lifetime as the heir apparent to Karl Marx himself. In his youth, he studied under Friedrich Engels alongside his close friend and longtime collaborator, Eduard Bernstein, 1850 to 1932. Kautsky published the bulk of the theoretical work in Die Neue Zeit, a journal connected to the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and served as its executive editor from 1880 until his removal from its masthead in 1917. In Die Neue Zeit, we find the bulk of Kautsky's articles and debates he engaged in. Such articles established the discursive grounds of Marxist orthodoxy. I don't love that phrase, but sure. Definitely established the orthodoxy of the Second International. Particularly of the Marxist center of the Second International. Sometimes people think Kautsky is the right of the Second International, and that's a big mistake. Many of these articles were also the basis for what would later become Kautsky's long-form text, Die Autographage, the Agrarian Question, and Die Social Revolution, the Social Revolution. Probably not that close to the French. Kautsky's article and Die Neue Zeit helped contextualize his popular text by making the dictatorship of the proletariat more explicit, although he barely used the term. He did use it, but he barely used it. The Imperial Press Law of 1874 and the banning of the Social Democratic Party in 1875 to 1890 meant that the coded language which used to avoid censorship was more necessary for books than imperial articles. And I think that's maybe why he didn't use the term. But Hal Draper missed this, and so this is why I wanted to talk about this. This essay seeks to consolidate Kautsky's contribution to a vital, frequently misunderstood concept within Marxism, the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, and demonstrate the influence of Kautsky's treatment of the concept in the revolutionary Marxist politics. Kautsky's writings from 1880s to the early 1910s were a particular focus because of the role of Dictatorship of the Proletariat played in debates regarding the agrarian question, parliamentary politics, and the Russian context, particularly before the October Revolution. All of these writings reveal the persistence of democratic Republican ideas that became increasingly legible only through working class politics. Kautsky's writings on the Dictatorship of the Proletariat served as a waypoint between Marx and Lenin. I think that's true. My argument extends a slowly emerging literature on Kautsky and a substantial impact on the Bolsheviks. Maury O'Donnell's Marxism and the Revolution, Karl Kautsky and the Russian Marxist, demonstrates that debates within the two factions of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP. I shouldn't say it like it's Russian. I mean German when I'm talking about Russians. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were often littered with quotes and citations from Kautsky. In 2008, Lars Lee published his groundbreaking Lenin We Discovered What Is to Be Done in Context, which illustrated Lenin's writing as a Russian articulation of Arfordianism. Lee uses this term to describe the general outlook of the German social democratic politics articulated in Kautsky's Erfurt program that found its way to the Russian context by way of Lenin's What Is to Be Done. I will say that I slightly think Lee underestimates the influence of radical left nationalism on Lenin, which Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, actually talked about, even in early Lenin. But I do think it is a pretty good way to understand the bridge between Lenin and Kautsky. The vanguard party, often attributed to Lenin, was actually from the SPD. Democratic centralism, often attributed to Lenin, actually comes from the SPD and was not even from the Marxist faction of the SPD, although it is kind of implicit in Marx, depending on how you define democratic centralism, because Marx was pro-democrat and pro-centralist, but we can get into that. But it was actually invented by a guy named Schweitzer, who was a Lassallean. I've talked about this in other episodes. So, yeah. Accompanying these texts between the new translations in the English of Kautsky's political writings contain Richard Day and Daniel Guido's Witness to the Permanent Revolution, the documentary writer, and Ben Lewis's Karl Kautsky on Democracy and Republicanism. And I like Ben Lewis's work a lot. He's been a guest on the show twice. The former contains Kautsky's writing endorsing the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP. Sorry, I got to stop that. I should only say SPD. RSDLP during the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the linear contains debates cited by the Bolsheviks in their ideological and strategic battles with their rivals. Although I do think you have to look, I do think there's some interesting problems with Kautsky's debates about the dictatorship of the proletariat later, after 1917, but we're going to forget that. This essay also seeks to show that what has been accepted as gospel and what Kautsky in the Western and Soviet literature has been profoundly misleading. I know Ian has a personal problem with Karl Korsch's Marxism and philosophy. Karl Korsch's Marxism and philosophy sanctioned the reading of Kautsky as exclusively positivistic, Darwinian vulgar Marxist whose writings contain not a whiff of the general materialist and revolutionary principles of Marxism. And it is these writings that we see the origin of Kautsky as a straw man for vulgar Marxism, later invoked by Walter Benjamin, Antonio Gramsci, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Louis Althusser. I think it's hard to relate all those people back to Karl Korsch, actually, Ian, and I think you're going to have to do more than just assert that. I do think it's a problem, and I do think that's where the first person you see it, but I don't think that Louis Althusser got that from Karl Korsch. Anyway. Joseph Stalin's short course of Marxism-Leninism is equally responsible for dismissing Kautsky. I think this is actually more where it comes from in Louis Althusser, quite frankly, Ian. It argues that the Bolshevik Party, the founding party of the Third International, is a party of a new type, fundamentally different from the Social Democratic parties of the Second International. The whole of history of the Bolsheviks and Social Democrats influenced by Kautsky was, as Stalin was wont to do, wholly erased. The flip side is scholarship regarding the dictatorship of the proletariat. I do think maybe in Lee and a lot of the cosmonaut crew, there's a slight overemphasis on the continuity between Kautsky and Lenin, not because there isn't a lot of continuity. I actually think they're right, but that continuity starts to break down after 1917. But that's beyond the scope of this article. So let's get back here. And like I said, I do think that Korsch is wrong about that. Kautsky's not a genuine materialist. I actually think Kautsky ended up being a whipping boy for Course's real polemic, which was the Gorlitz program and the neo-Lassalleanism that Bernstein accepted when they re-entered the SPD from the independent SPD, or the USPD. So anyway, and I do think that is one of the sources of the misreading. But I honestly think when you're looking at a lot of these people, you just have to be honest and say it comes from Stalin. Like, and some misreadings of Lenin himself, including the Renegade-Kamsky pamphlet, because Kamsky's positions actually are hard to understand in the Renegade-Kamsky pamphlet. For example, it makes it sound like he supported the war and sided with the right in that pamphlet, and he did not. But he was ambivalent about it, which is what Lenin was calling him out on, particularly when he tried to justify that maybe the war was kind of justifiable if you look at Serbian liberation, blah, blah, blah. And that's where Lenin really comes down on him. But if you don't know the context, it just seems like Kautsky bad. Scanned in its own right, the literature of dictatorship of the proletariat has little to say regarding Kautsky's writings on the subject. One major work, Hal Draper's Dictatorship of the Proletariat from Marx and Lenin, is almost entirely dismissive of Kautsky. This is, I agree with actually of Ian here. I thought it was a little bit too dismissive of Kautsky. I didn't bring that up as much, but he only talks about Kautsky after 1917 and doesn't really deal with the earlier periods. Presenting his use of the concept as little more than revolutionary window dressing for reformist practice. Yep, he does do that. I could completely agree. John Ehrenberg's Dictatorship of the Proletariat, Marxism's Theory of Socialist Democracy, all but ignores Kautsky altogether. I agree with that too. I haven't covered that book here, but it's the other book. I think Hal Draper's book is pretty good, but it does, I think, unfairly tar Kautsky almost solely with his debates with Trotsky in the 1920s. As his primary view of the dictatorship, and then also makes his use early on seem insincere, which I think is unfair. Draper wasn't always fair in that book, and I actually pointed that out when I read it. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not a legible concept without proper attention to Kautsky's interventions. Effacing Kautsky's contribution to this topic results in an absurd notion that Karl Marx had developed his entire political outlook in perfect form, and that Lenin was the only person able to divine it. Well, I mean, to be fair, Hal Draper does not accuse Lenin able to divine it. He actually attacks Lenin being able to divine it. So that's not something that Draper believes, but we'll continue. By contextualizing the space between Marx and Lenin, we can see how the dictatorship of the proletariat developed over time and functioned in different contexts. Given the conceptual character of the dictatorship of the proletariat, however, it can be clarified through other political categories intimately bound up with it. Well, we'll see if I agree with you on this, Ian. Adjacent concepts: the program, intransigence, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. This one is interesting. All right. Through its pre-First World War writings, Kautsky presented the dictatorship of the proletariat as a form of political rule by the working class that mandates the transition from capitalism to socialism. To adjacent concepts, the minimum maximum program and the strategy of intransigence help clarify Kautsky's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The first section of the classical social democratic political programs, the minimum section, enumerated the reforms that the party would campaign for when not in power. Right. This is a little bit more than what Marx advocated for, frankly. Marx advocated almost for like a Tea Party of socialists where you would make demands, but most of what you would do parliamentarily was negative. You would mostly block stuff, and you would not sit in a government where you were not solely in power. That was actually a big part of that. Kautsky mostly maintained that, but kind of added the minimum section based off of the immediate demands in the transitional program in the manifesto, right? And in the Left Party in France. In the Offer Program of 1891, written with Edward Bernstein, Kautsky provides precisely such an enumeration through its political demands. The form of political freedom that the party campaigned for were divided between civil rights and democratization of state institutions. Civil rights took the form of universal suffrage alongside freedom of speech. Yep. Press. Yep. Association and religion. Democratization of state institutions meant that they would become increasingly staffed by and subordinated to the working class. This is what's really, it's not the most important thing. This other thing is important, but this is the distinction between this and like petty bourgeois liberal politics. Right. This would mean a replacement of the standing army with the people's militia, the secularization of education, free medical care, progressive tax policy, and a fair legal system. By enumerating these political demands, the party could present a vision of precisely what it believed in and what society would look like under a proletarian dictatorship. I'm not sure you'd need a progressive tax policy under a proletarian dictatorship. But anyway, Kautsky also argued that achieving the partial demands would increase the confidence of the working class to direct society as a whole. The concept of the minimum program persisted in Lenin's thought as well. Even after the revolution of 1917, Lenin continued to insist that it was necessary to maintain the minimum program due to the possibility that Bolsheviks could lose power and may have to start all over again. That's absolutely true, and something that I think Trotsky actually misses. But anyway, we'll go back to that. The maximum section of the program enumerated the economic reforms that would transition capitalism to socialism under the direction of the proletariat. Workers' protections would be the first on the agenda in the form of the 8-hour day, the abolition of child labor, although asterisk, that meant something different than we mean by it. Prohibition of most night work, 36 hours of free time per week, and a guarantee that wages would always be paid in monetary wages. So no wages in script, fuckers. Plenty of reforms outlined in these programs have been achieved in the 20th century. However, the difference between the contemporary reforms and social democratic political vision can be found in who inaugurated them. Yep. And it is imposing the question of who inaugurated such reforms that is the importance of the dictatorship of the proletariat comes to the fore. Rather than progressive reforms resulting from concessions to the working class, they would be part of a project that increasingly democratized society. The result would be precisely what Andreas Kalavas describes in his theory of radical democracy, establishing the political superiority of part that counts less over the part that counts more, not to exterminate the rich, but to constitute relations of power and construct structures of authority that will privilege and benefit the poor in the ongoing political struggle. It wouldn't just benefit the poor, it would benefit workers who tended to be poor. But Marx is pretty explicit that poverty is not the main thing. Kautsky himself says the same thing in the Social Revolution. Okay, quote it. And you do, so cool. The abolition of employment, he felt, would result in the capitalists ceasing to be their workers' masters and exploiters. Instead, it would be increasingly subject to oversight by the majority of society. Achieving social democratic demands of the minimum program, Kautsky believed, would require a strategy of intransigence. This meant that the party would refuse to take part in a government without the minimum demands having been fulfilled, which is kind of a development of Marx's like left Tea Partyism. Social Democrats would campaign for their program in the periphery of political power in the familiar forms of political activity, such as marches, protests, raising awareness of issues through newspapers. In addition, they would raise awareness through their thriving alternative culture composed of sports clubs, beer calls, educational institutions, and libraries. You can kind of see the beginning notions of dual power here, actually, and the way Lenin used it. This will allow enormous numbers of workers to be exposed to the ideas of social democracy while also allowing the party to retain an independent spirit and not have to actually rule over a capitalist economy when they weren't in control of it. It also followed that the SPD vehemently opposed the state and directed itself towards politically strategy, centering the expression of political freedom rather than the acquisition of existing state power. That's important. Actually, Ian's made a very good point here. To seek out the latter would have to make the Social Democrats responsible for running the institutions they sought to abolish, and which, according to the theory of class struggle, were meant to police the very people they claimed to represent. However, this would not mean that Social Democrats would not take up political office. Yeah, I actually agreed with this. Kautsky's resolution at the 1904 Amsterdam Congress declared that the parties of the Second International would only hold office in state administration under exceptional conditions, and that the individual representatives who did so would remain subordinate to the rank and file of the party. That's really important. It is kind of a development from some of Marx's theories, where Marx really said that, socialists could be MPs in the legislature, but should really be hesitant taking any ruling role if they're not in charge of that legislature, like almost solely. And that they should be primarily a negative force in politics until they can do so, while advocating for their program. All right. Social Democrats found it accessible to take positions in representative bodies, but not executive ones. Bingo. Thank you. In doing so, representatives such as August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, Karl's dad, and I say that because I've gotten that confused too, would use such positions as pulpits to spread the message of socialism. These resolutions are precisely what Lenin alludes to in describing the character of a revolutionary social democrat as a tribune of the people. To be a tribune is to be a party nominee or elected official responsible for confronting the state at the level of oratory and spreading the message of socialism. Intransigence, the orientation of the tribune, is, in short, the concrete articulation of the old First International motto: the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class themselves. Marx, Engels, Kautsky, and Lenin all presume that the dictatorship of the proletariat is an interstitial form of political rule. Absolutely agree. It is not a form of socialism. For all these thinkers, between capitalism and communism lies the stage of the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, where the latter has conquered political power, but a new form of production is not yet fully developed and implemented. The notion of an interstitial form of political rule is not original. In fact, it is quite ancient, having been borrowed from the Roman Republic. A lot of this was borrowed from the Roman Republic, which we should think about quite a bit. All right. Dictatorships subtended the structure of political life under the Roman Republic as a mechanism for nominating generals to be periodic dictators who would then bring order to the Republic. It's, when you change a government, the old laws don't apply. So, yeah. The concept implies the presence of a crisis in which a dictator must save society from. Given the broader context for Kautsky's uses of concept, the scrutinizing logic of dictatorship is rearticulated through the strategy of intransigence. In carrying out the strategy, the party waits for a crisis to emerge while its growth in strength and confidence. When the crisis emerges, the working class will be ready to instill order over society. The crisis-prone character of capitalism made the dictatorship of the proletariat emerge as a historical necessity for steering society out of various economic upheavals that were emerging with increasing frequency. Further, it was Kautsky's view that the period of dictatorship, quote, is by no means necessarily accompanied by violence and bloodshed. Revolution did not have to be violent, but depended entirely on the context. Revolution didn't have to be violent, but both Marx and Engels thought it was most likely going to be violent defensively no matter what. But Kautsky was a little bit more hopeful in that question, but he didn't go as far as Bernstein did, and that's important. Violence would only emerge if revanchist forces attempted to overthrow the dictatorship of the proletariat, as they had done it during the Paris Commune. Kautsky, in all likelihood, would have preferred the type of political revolution that swept the SPD into power in 1918 after the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, namely a peaceful transition of power in the midst of a collapsing government and enormous support from the majority of the population in the form of workers' organizations and electoral support. The difference, however, would have been the fulfillment of the minimum program and thus the subordination of state apparatus to the working class. The prehistory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Historically, the dictatorship of the proletariat had emerged sporadically while being, according to Marx and Engels themselves, the most important aspect of their thought. Hal Draper identifies 3 periods and 12 loci where Marx and Engels use the concept. Yet loci are just locations in text, mainly in their reflections on the European revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871, as well as their tutelage of the German Social Democrats. The most important among these writings is Marx's letters to his fellow revolutionary Joseph Wedemeyer. In it, Marx sought to correct the idea that he could be credited with the discovery of the concept of class struggle, which Marx claimed prior historians had already identified, and Marx was right about that. Whether what he identified was, 1, the existence of classes is bound up with a particular historical phases in development of production. They're not eternal, they're not transhistorical. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to dictatorship of the proletariat, and 3, that the dictatorship of the proletariat itself constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes into a classless society. English's preface to the Civil War in France further elucidates the importance of the dictatorship in the conceptual terrain of early Marxism. Criticizing the right wing of the German Social Democrats, Engels argued, quote, of late, the Social Democratic Philistine has once more been filled with the wholesome terror at the words, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what the dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Asterisk. I will say you do have to actually look at the arguments with the Blanquist for why this is so different than the way the dictatorship of the proletariat is often used, because the Blanquist also used it and used it in a different manner. Hal Draper covers that. Ian may get to it, but he hasn't got to it yet. It is essential to note that the profound impact that the Paris Commune had on the political programs of the Social Democratic parties. Major aspects of the program, including the abolition of the standing army in favor of the workers' militia, subordination of police to the citizens, democratic centralism through a unicameral legislative body of the Commune. He didn't use the word democratic centralism, but he was a centralist and he was a Democrat. That's important. I just think it is sketchy to use that phrasing before Schweitzer because no one did. And it has other implications. Recallability of officials and political freedom were all present during the Commune's brief existence. The Paris Commune served as a validation of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a key concept in Marx and Engels' theory of history. And it was what their argument was against the Babeuf and Blanquist versions of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was more commonly thought of as a dictatorship for the proletariat. This is why I do think it's important to note that. It was actually in those debates where the term first emerged, because they were like, it was actually being offered as an alternative vision of the dictatorship of proletariat based on the Paris Commune. It is proof positive for their belief that the proletariat was uniquely capable of directing society because their lack of property and ever-increasing size caused them to create a new social form outside of hegemonic society. This included, but was not limited to, political parties, trade unions, mutual aid networks. A final component worth mentioning of Marx's articulation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Oh, you get into it. Thank you. I was being overly critical. As how it functions as a criticism directed at a fellow 1848 revolutionary, Louis-Auguste Blanqui. As Draper points out, Marx argues for the entire class of the proletariat to seize power. This has contraposed itself to the conspiratorial monetarian revolution imagined by Blanqui. Given that the dictatorship of the proletariat has its beginnings in a call for radical majoritarian democracy, the majoritarian and democratic model of the dictatorship automatically assumes the presence of a program, an idea that Marx contributed to in the form of the Communist Manifesto, even though he wouldn't endorse that program, and the 1880 program of the French Workers' Party, which is a better program, actually. I love the manifesto, but the program of the manifesto is not as good as the 1880 program of the French Workers' Party. It's just not. German social democracy emerged from the union of two predominant strains of late 19th century German socialist politics, Marxism and Lassalleanism. While Marx was a great theorist for the working class, Ferdinand Lassalle was its demagogic activist, campaigner, and organizer. The Marxists formed the I'm just going to Social Democratic Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, the SDP, led by August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht. The Lassalleans inhabited the Allgemeine Deutsche Arbeiterverein, the General German Workers' Organizations, ADAV, controlled from the top by John Baptista von Schweitzer, the guy who invented democratic centralism as a concept. Although, like I said, I when people say it's not in Marx, it's implied in Marx. It's just not stated. It's Schweitzer who actually invents it. The Marxists called for, according to Gary Stetson, an executive committee elected by the rank and file membership with no control over the party press. The party press would instead become a forum for open debate and discussion rather than simply a propaganda mill. Meanwhile, the Lassalleans sought to create a workers' organization that could act as a constituency to pass legislation to improve the existing Bismarckian state on behalf of the working class. Yeah, which Marx hated. He didn't totally hate Lassalle. I mean, he did call Lassalle a bunch of bad names, but he didn't totally hate Lassalle, even though he wanted to undermine this and a few other theoretical things really hard. On top of this interest in the working class political independence, the ADAV did not unify around a political program, but instead the figure of von Schweitzer after Lassalle died. In 1875, the SDP and the ADAV united into the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and Gotha, I said it right, I think, not Gotha, Gotha, Germany. This resulted in the Gotha program, which Marx famously criticized in his Gotha critique of the Gotha program within the same year, which, I've talked about the controversies around that. Despite Marx's criticism of the Gotha program, the unification of the two social democratic organizations was an enormous victory for the Marxist faction. Yeah, it actually ended up being better for them than it initially looked. Bebel and Liebknecht achieved their desired central committee structure, guaranteeing the party press would be made autonomous. Moreover, such reforms in the party meant that it would not be led by a cult of personality, but would, for the coming decades, be unified by its program. Further, despite the Gotha programs a Salian tenor. It set the stage for the hegemony of Marxists not only in the party, but in the whole Second International. The Lassalleans were still there, and they come back a couple times, particularly in the Görlitz period in the 1920s, but they aren't dominant. This new party structure would allow the free flow of arguments, permitting both majority and minority views to be voiced, which, the Bolsheviks suppressed after 1921. However, it did not mean that Kautsky was essentially barred from ever holding office in the party. However, it did mean that Kautsky was essentially barred from ever holding office in the party, given his editorship of Die Neue Zeit. Nonetheless, he participated in writing some political programs to which we now turn. Yep. In 1891, Kautsky wrote The Class Struggle as a supplemental text for the Effort program. You should read it. It was presented as an ideological outlook of social democracy and was published with the program. It was, according to Lars Lee, the book one read to find out what it meant to be a social democrat. None other than young Vladimir Lenin translated the text into Russian in 1894. Kautsky's strategic text discussed below, parliamentarism and social democracy, as well as Karl Marx's critique of the Gotha program, were intimately connected to the class struggle. The critique, while much older, had been hidden away, first by Engels and then by Bebel and Liebknecht. Marx's critique finally saw the light of day in the presses of Die Neue Zeit to provide the authoritative backing to the class struggle in 1891. Kautsky and Engels basically made sure that happened. Listen, is Engels dead yet? I don't remember when Engels died. Uh, 1895. He was not yet dead. All right, so he was involved in that. I'd always said that Engels published it in the party press, so I was just making sure that I wasn't somehow wrong about that. The absence of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a phrase in the class struggle did not mean its absence as a concept, but instead an analogous term, which I think this is where Draper messes up. And I agree with Ian on this. Engels himself was aware of this, stating in his critique of the draft program that Kautsky and Bernstein should call for the concentration of all political power in the hands of the people's representatives, aka in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead of explicitly referring to the dictatorship of the proletariat, Kautsky used the language of democratic republicanism. This reveals the degree to which socialist thought during the late 19th century saw itself as a continuation of older radical traditions. I actually agree with this. I actually think socialism is not liberalism, but it emerges from it, and this is one of the ways in which it does. The language of republicanism and its understanding of power relations is more explicit in the fifth section of the of the Commonwealth of the Future. The chapter of the effort program focused on state socialism and social democracy. Here, Kautsky argues that the nationalization of industry is not automatically socialism, just like Engels had said, and actually Kautsky was doing that on Engels' suggestion. As any act of doing so still proposes, the nationalization of industries will not go further than the interests of the ruling class demanded, because they're in control of the state. This is contraposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is clearly alluded to when he uses the term cooperative commonwealth. This is the clearest example is in this passage. The state will not cease to be a capitalist institution until the proletariat, the working class, has become the ruling class, and not until then will it become possible to turn it into a cooperative commonwealth. At the level of theory, the two sentences repeat what Quentin Skinner and Philip Petit describe as a critique of domination central to civic republicanism. This is non-liberal republicanism. I like Quentin Skinner on this. That is the argument that one is not free so long as that they play no part in defining the parameters of how society they inhibit operates. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie means a small majority retains the right to veto any alteration to society rather than the majority. A small majority? Do you mean a small minority? Small minority. I'm going to fix that for you. In other words, the capitalist class decides what rules of the game everyone else is forced to play. Opposed to this would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, when the nationalization of industry by a political order determined by the proletariat interests rather than those of the bourgeoisie will result in a cooperative production by factory councils on a mass scale. Proto to the Soviet system, the early Soviet system, the system of Soviets. Of course, Kautsky and his fellow social democratic thinkers were rarely so specific. The point was simply that the nature of the proletariat was highly collaborative workforce meant that its rule would lead to universal freedom rather than more forms of arbitrary domination. A more explicit Republican document from the same time period as the AFRIT program, and which has only recently been excavated by Lars Lee and translated by Ben Lewis. God, I love Ben Lewis's translations. Anyway, is Kautsky's article, Parliamentarianism and Social Democracy. Published in Die Neue Zeit soon after the effort program, Parliamentarianism and Social Democracy was a general outline of the political strategy of social democracy, especially, as the title would suggest, in relation to representative democracy. According to Lee, quote, the book brings together better than anywhere the logic behind what the Russians labeled the strategy of proletarian hegemony in the democratic revolution. In fact, this article is the true origins of Lenin's What is to be done, as argued a decade earlier for the idea of social democratic guidance of the class struggle of the proletariat. Parliamentarianism was intended as a critique of direct democracy and the call for the abolition of any form of representative politics developed by one of the founders of the SPD, Moritz Rittenhausen. I actually did not know that. Thank you, Ian. Kautsky's argument against direct democracy, conceived by Rittenhausen as the distribution of voting on legislation to tens of thousands of assemblies rather than a single unicameral legislature, was that it would not simplify legislative activity, but instead confuse it. The problem is that legislation involved just as much writing and revision of laws as does voting on them. Given the assemblies would only vote yes or no in Rittenhausen's direct form of democracy, says Kautsky, it would result in a population not having any role in the liberation of the implementation of new laws, which is actually a pretty decent point. Rittenhausen and Kautsky's view fetishizes a political form while neglecting issues of political power. Rather than direct democracy, Kautsky argues for representative democracy subordinated to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky states explicitly that a real parliamentary regime can just as well be an instrument for the dictatorship of the proletariat as it can be an instrument for the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, depending on who's in control, obviously. The social class that held veto power over the organization of political institutions determined the character of the state. Such political institutions were therefore not neutral, but rather contested amongst various social classes and usually won by the ruling class. I'm just going to add that because it's true. Lenin repeated the logic of Kautsky's argument in his own writings on the dictatorship of the proletariat, stating, the state is only a weapon, note similar to the word instrument, of the proletarian and the class struggle. And further, when discussing the Soviets, described them as a particular institution of embryonic revolutionary authority. Although Lenin's later criticism of Kautsky and State and Revolution are scathing, it is worth noting, to echo Lee, there is no reason why Soviet democracy would be counterposed to what Kautsky described as representative democracy, given that the councillors were elected deputies from various political parties composed of workers, soldiers, sailors, and peasants. I agree, although I do think we do have to deal with how scathing later Lenin becomes of Kautsky. This is one thing I've accused largely of underplaying in the past. He's not wrong, but you know, it's like when I point out that Lars Lee, even though he wrote his first research on the Russian Civil War, often ignored it in his later biography of Lenin. It's similar things. My disagreements with Lee often is not that he's wrong, but that he's underplaying certain things. The last of those groups mentioned, the peasantry, was extremely the last of those groups mentioned, the peasantry, was an extremely important subject in both Germany and Russia, and we therefore turn to what is known as the agrarian debates in the history of social democracy. This is fun stuff. All right. This was actually kind of not discussed in the Draper book, and it was a big oversight. Really big. And this is why I like Ian Szabo's work here. Szabo? Yeah. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority of Central Europe was predominantly rural, but undergoing a seismic shift in class composition. Adam Tooze notes that the emergent and global economy of the period and its impact on rural population was one of the fundamental questions facing European societies. Thank you, Adam Tooze, even though you're not a Marxist. The agrarian question was therefore a major impact on the formation of Kautsky's thinking on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky's 1895 series of articles entitled Unser Neuestes Program, our new program, and that Neue Zeit, our New Times, articulated precisely how the Social Democratic politics addressed agrarian policy. The article criticized the SPD's Agrarian Commission of the same year for putting forward Lassallean state socialist demands, such as state assistance to the landowners in the form of nationalized mortgages, national insurance, and lowered interest rates. Sounds like the New Deal. While it is more than likely Kautsky agreed with some of the programmatic demands developed by the Commission, especially the extension of labor rights to rural workers, Kautsky mainly disagreed with the Lassallean character of the proposals. Nationalized mortgages and insurance, Kautsky argued, would result in support by the peasants for a large landowning class. By making the peasants dependent on state-backed mortgages and insurance, they would not support the working class in a struggle to overthrow the Bismarckian state. Kautsky claimed that only through the dictatorship of the proletariat would such reforms be acceptable. So he's not against the reforms necessarily in fact, but in principle, because who's doing them and how they're doing them. Drawing the peasantry to support the revolutionary movement. Any alliance between the proletariat and peasants had to be predicated on the proletariat taking responsibility for the reforms that would benefit the peasantry. If it was achieved, the peasantry would rise to the defense of the revolution if it came under the attack by forces allied with the bourgeoisie. These series of articles also set the stage for a full-length book on the project The Agrarian Question. The Agrarian Question recapitulates Kautsky's argument from 1895 while also expanding and enriching his own views on the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Agrarian Question, Kautsky discussed the idea of the transformation of the police state to a cultural state. The police state referred specifically to the state whose entire institutional apparatus was directed towards the defense of private property, like our state. When Social Democrats called for the abolition of the standing army, the object was the abolition of the police state. The working class stood on the other side, taking over the state and taking responsibility for agrarian reforms and also for policing and other things. Universal militias, that's what part of this is about. This would lead to the formation of a cultural state. The concept of a cultural state appears to stand in for the dictatorship of the proletariat while also clarifying Kautsky's view of the future state. Kautsky's usage points to the idea of the state under socialism as increasingly subordinated to society, or the alternate institutions created by the workers and the peasants. These institutions range from mutual aid networks to sports clubs, while the main commonality being that they were either separate or semi-autonomous from the state. Thus, we have in Kautsky the beginnings of Lenin's specific articulation of dual power. We do. It's there. It's right there. Right there. Thank you, Ian, because I don't think I ever realized that before. Good job. Much of the Agrarian Question is a recapitulation of the effort program. Both it and the prior articles on the same subject clarify the relationship between the dictatorship of the proletariat and non-proletarian classes. The arguments passed in these texts would eventually become the Leninist theory of Snikchach. I can't pronounce Russian. If you think I can't pronounce German and French, actually, I kind of do know how to pronounce German when I try, but I can't pronounce fucking Russian. Smikcha, unifying the struggle of the proletariat with that of the peasantry. Donald has also demonstrated that the Agrarian Question was the text in Russia. The Menshevik and Bolshevik factions of the Russian Social Democratic Party quoted at each other to back their arguments. However, the agrarian debates were primarily among Germans in the leadership of the SPD, a political terrain which saw seismic shifts when the leading members of the Marxist faction, Edward Bernstein, defected to the Lassallean faction. Yep, and he stayed there and came back and did neo-Lassalleanism later. This led to a momentous debate in the German Social Democratic, known as the Revisionist controversy. In German Social Democracy, known as the Revisionist controversy. The dictatorship of the proletariat and the Revisionist controversy. This is something else I think Draper completely missed. In 1896, Edward Bernstein inaugurated the Revisionist controversy by abandoning Marxism and embracing Lassalleanism. Bernstein had studied alongside Kautsky under Engels, and the two were extremely close co-thinkers. However, as H and J.M. Tudor described, Bernstein's political engagements became increasingly academic and politically disengaged, moving more towards conservatism of German neo-Kantianism and the gradualist politics of English Fabianism. Actually, we need to talk about the German neo-Kantians in the German historical school and that form of socialism, because they actually are influential on both Lassalleans and the social democratic right wing, pretty hard. And I think it's understudied. I've talked a lot about the German historical school, which is actually the origins of things like modern monetary theory and why it was rejected so hard by Marx and later Marxists. Social Democrats should therefore collaborate with whatever forces in society would allow them to gain political victories. It is in this context that the idea of intransigence and its relation to dictatorship of the proletariat was further extended in Kautsky's writings. And I think Kautsky's being a pretty good Marxist here, honestly. I mean, he's developing some of the implications of Marx's letters, but they are in Marx's letters. He didn't come up with this completely out of nothing. An important article within the revisionist controversy was Kautsky's The Republic and Social Democracy in France. In it, Kautsky explicitly binds intransigence and the dictatorships of proletariat together. He did so by responding to a member of the revisionist faction of the SPD, Kurt Eisner. Eisner urged the Social Democrat, the Second International, I misread that, to fight for a republic so to alleviate the evil of class contradiction by appealing to indeterminate factions of the bourgeoisie. According to this logic, sections of the bourgeoisie would be amenable to social democracy because it was a form of politics that takes in bourgeois society, kind of like everyone tailing everyone else today. Anyway, Kautsky did not take issue with the notion that the Second International should struggle for a republic. However, he took issue with the motivation behind Eisner's argument. A republic, according to Kautsky, was not desirable because it resolved class contradiction, but because it allowed it to be heightened and made explicit. Class contradiction would be made explicit through the struggle for political freedom, allowing the working class to organize itself openly. To this end, Kautsky here urges the need for political intransigence, stating the conquest of state power by the proletariat, therefore, does not simply mean the conquest of the government ministries, which is then, without further ado, administers the previous means of rule. The crisis-prone character of capitalism will create opportunities for the organized working class to acquire concessions from the state as a prelude to its conquest of power. This would then inaugurate a whole new form of rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky debated Eisner rather than Bernstein to avoid attacking one of his closest friends. Yep, that's probably true. I have done that in the past and regretted doing it. Should have just attacked them. Sorry. However, a direct confrontation was inevitable. Yep, it almost always is. Just as the agrarian question consolidated Kautsky's views on social democracy's relationship to the peasantry, the social revolution consolidated his views on revolutionary politics as a whole. It also shares similarity with the Offert program, although it lacks its explicit use of the term dictatorship of the proletariat. The text was Kautsky's long-awaited response to Edward Bernstein's evolutionary socialism, which presented the idea of socialism as something that emerged gradually. Kautsky argued that Bernstein's theorization was not evolutionary, as evolution is not gradual but occurs in stops and starts. By the way, this is where a lot of debates between different evolutionists come from in the late 20th century. Stephen Jay Gould actually was a big proponent of this, as opposed to the neo-Darwinians, who actually did kind of see things as gradual. In keeping with the naturalist zeitgeist of the time, Kautsky analyzes the revolution as a gradual process of illustration and the eruption of birth. The social revolution discussed what would occur under the dictatorship of the proletariat by examining the consolidation of production alongside universal employment. Here, Kautsky argued that the major historical specific dynamic of capitalist society is unemployment, due to workers being made increasingly superfluous thanks to the development of productive forces. Cough, cough. Feels familiar. State political power meant, therefore, to socialize production in such a way that there would be full employment. This would result in necessary labor being so reduced due to the already existing productivity of capitalist infrastructure that it amounted to the abolition of work. The dictatorship of the proletariat was a political means for the socializing of production and thusly abolishing the conditions necessary for the reproduction of the working class. However, for that to occur, a revolution would have to happen. In Russia in 1905, Kautsky's ideas would finally be applied to a revolutionary context, resulting in major changes to his thinking. Kautsky on the Russian Revolution of 1905. And again, Draper didn't cover this well. So back to this. Although socialist policies have existed in Russia by the end of the 19th century, articulated by such figures as Alexander Herzen, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin, and practiced in the form of narodnik and anarchist politics, social democracy was in its infancy up to the revolution of 1905. The revolution itself was precipitated by social forces that drove the popularity of the narodniks and the anarchists. Increasingly organized agrarian movements were dissatisfied with the medieval legal structure keeping them bound to the land. Unionization among the nascent urban working class was made illegal. Worse still, unemployed and disillusioned soldiers have returned from the disastrous Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Finally, Russia had, since the beginning of the 19th century, seen the rise of a restless and highly educated intellectia, which had never been reliable supporters of the Romanov dynasty. In this context, such figures as Vera Sasulich, Georgy Plekhanov, Alexander Bogdanov, Leon Trotsky, and Vladimir Lenin would emerge as leading figures of the Russian social democracy. Moreover, all of these thinkers imported the Marxist strategy formulated by Kautsky into Russia. such as the struggle for political freedom. Moreover, the features familiar with anyone from the 1917 revolution will find nascent forms in 1905. Large agrarian political parties, revolutionary social democrats, Soviets, workers' councils are all some of these features. Kautsky's response to 1905, however, differed heavily from his response to the 1917 revolution. Oh boy, did it! But anyway, yeah, we'll get back to that. Given Kautsky's later condemnation of Bolshevik revolution, one would have never expected to find the writings of his that outlined the revolutionary strategy enacted a decade later. However, it is his writings on Russia that Kautsky does precisely that. In terms of taking power, Kautsky here argued that it is very possible that in the course of the revolution, victory will fall to the Russian Social-Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP, the party apparatus which represents the working class may have to take power rather than the working class itself in Russia, because the working class was simply too small compared to Russia's enormous peasant population. This actually sounds the opposite of what he argues in his debates with Trotsky in the 20s. This was a major addendum to the concept of dictatorship of the proletariat. Rather than the dictatorship of the proletariat being a dictatorship articulated through a commune state composed of plurality of workers' organizations, such as in Paris in 1870, this would be a dictatorship articulated in a single political party. This likely appeared as a legible idea to Kautsky and his Russian followers because the SPD had become hegemonic in Germany. Though the single party rule is neither the goal nor what initially happened in 1917, it does explain why such eventualities was acceptable in the Russian context. When such possibility occurred, however, Kautsky condemned it. And I think Kautsky's writings in this are actually mixed when and why he condemned it. But I'd have to go into that more by reading Kautsky and telling you. Bolsheviks responded by pointing out that they owed their entire political outlook to Kautsky. In his 1924 Path to the Russian Revolution, called Radek describes Kautsky as solidly with the Bolsheviks from 1905 to 1907. Kautsky claimed that he sided with the Menshevik argument that Russia required a bourgeois revolution prior to the proletarian revolution. Radek quoted Kautsky's own argument at Kautsky to dispel such an argument. By identifying a continuity from 1905 to the 1917 revolution, Radek presented the views that it was Kautsky that broke with his own thought rather than the Bolsheviks breaking from Kautsky. I think that's more. I think there's a point there, but I actually think it's more ambivalent than that. I think even Draper points to the ambivalence in some of that, because Draper does not have like great things to say about everything Lenin wrote about the dictatorship of the proletariat himself, and that's despite being a Trotskyist and thus an admirer of Lenin. He actually even criticizes Trotsky in that book. After the revolution of 1917 and the rise of Weimar Germany, the revolutionary characteristics of Kautsky's thought rapidly began to disappear. He tangled with Lenin and Leon Trotsky in the condemnations of the October Revolution. I actually think some of his arguments there aren't terrible. Some of them are. Something he would continue to do until his death in 1938. The measures that the Bolsheviks took to cement their power, especially violence they committed, were too much for Kautsky to stomach. Kautsky had long opposed violence because he viewed it as a strategy of bourgeois revolution, as had been the case in the French Revolution. More important, he viewed it as a strategy of minority rule that would undo itself. I think Ian needs to talk about that a little more. More importantly, Kautsky's rejection of the Bolshevik Revolution was due to his own inability to find relevance in a world fractured by the First World War. Okay. In the 1920 preface to The World of Power, he argues explicitly that it would be acceptable to enter coalition with bourgeois democratic forces if the Social Democratic Party were sufficiently organized. In essence, this meant that the strategy of intransigence was abandoned. Yep, that's important. That's key. And see, what Draper's right about Kautsky post 1920, which is why he misses all this. And I think there's a pre-1917 Kautsky blockage because of the Renegade Kautsky issue. Doing so would automatically mean that Marxist maximum minimum program, especially dictatorship of the proletariat, were abandoned as well. It is as if the structural integrity of Kautsky's thought had begun to disintegrate. Few comments made Kautsky's turn towards revisionism clearer than the transition found in his language and what constitutes the light and air of the working class. Political freedom was substituted with unity. Left unity. Not even once. No, I'm actually not totally against left unity, but it's got to be based on something substantive, like a fucking program. And that program's got to come from the working class. With guidance from socialists, sure, but from the working class. It can't be just imposed upon the working class. And that is where I differ with a lot of social Republican Marxists. It may be taken that 2 decades, but Kautsky had come to adopt Bernstein's language of movement being everything, the goal being nothing. I think the later writings of Kautsky and his contracts with the Bolsheviks need more development than Ian gives here. But I do think this is a very good article and fixes a lot of what's missing in Draper's writings on the subject. I love Draper's work on dictatorship of the proletariat. What's mean by it? I do. I even agree with some of his criticisms of Lenin in it, but he misreads Kautsky and presents all this as if it just wasn't there, and doesn't deal with why it wasn't there, the political reasons why that language was changed. I think Ian does us all a great favor by pointing that out. I think the scholarship here is very good. It clearly comes from a neo-Kautskist / early Leninist point of view, but this is very important stuff, and I'm glad he covered it. Thank you, Ian. You did a good job. Protect your peace. Listeners, protect your peace too. And keep reading if you're attracted to this stuff. Don't just stop at what I read. There's tons more to read on this. Read the books that are mentioned in this if this is something you want to learn about. Go read the translations of Ben Lewis. Check out what the Weekly Worker's doing. You know, go educate yourself. You don't have to agree with it, but check it out. Take care.